It is time now for us to move to our first panel discussion. My name is Sharifa Balagoon. I am Chief Legal and Compliance Counsel at CQ Credit Union. I am also co-chair of the DEI Programming Committee and will be hosting this session, Advancing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion on Boards, Why It is a Strategic Game Changer, sponsored by Perkins Coie. Now, before we get started, we have a few housekeeping notes. This discussion is being recorded and will be available at a later date. As a reminder, all comments are the panel's own. They should not be publicized without permission, should not be construed as legal advice, and do not represent the positions of their companies, clients, or the chapter. Please direct your attention to a few features that will help you enjoy and participate in today's program. For questions, please use the chat feature. We want this conversation to be interactive, but it can be difficult to chime in or ask a question orally on video conference. If you have a question or comment, feel free to ask a question using the chat function located at the bottom of your screen. Please post your question to everyone, and we will work to take your questions throughout the discussion. Also, please be sure you are identified on the screen with your first and last name, and please add your company as well. Let me now introduce our panel. Valerie Dahia is firm-wide chair and a securities trading and markets practice partner at Perkins Coie. She is an authority in broker-dealer law and advises broker-dealer clients on a myriad of regulatory issues. She also advises clients in the blockchain space that are seeking to register and operate alternative trading systems, or ATS, or exchanges to facilitate the trading of security tokens. Jill B. Lewis is the managing partner in Perkins Coie's Dallas office. She focuses her practice on advising companies with growth-oriented, liquidity-creating, and transformational strategies. Her experience includes leading strategic transactions for entrepreneurs, private equity sponsors, and portfolio companies, as well as members of the Fortune 50 with a particular emphasis on infrastructure, multi-location retail, transportation, manufacturing, and industrial sector matters. As Senior Vice President and General Counsel and Corporate Secretary at Seco Environmental Corp., Chastity Wilson-Henry is a key member of the senior leadership team and leads all aspects of the legal department, including corporate governance, strategic transactions, litigation, and compliance. Chastity is a zealous advocate of diversity and inclusion, particularly in the legal profession, both at law firms and in-house legal departments. To that end, Chastity is the founder of the New Roundtable, Inc., a nonprofit organization that drives the inclusion and advancement of African-American women attorneys within the legal profession through targeted relationship building and professional development initiatives. The organization is currently comprised of dozens of law firms and in-house attorneys. So now that you know a bit more about our amazing panelists, let's get started. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Jill.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to be here with ACC. During the time that I was actually an in-house lawyer for a period of time, ACC was a tremendous resource. And so we're really grateful to you all and the programming that you provide. I couldn't be more happy to be with this panel at the forefront, not only of the corporate world, but also with respect to diversity and inclusion. So we want to talk a little bit about the state of play. As you know, this panel is entitled Advancing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion on Boards. Why is it a strategic game changer? So let's start with the state of play. At this point, minority representation at corporate boards lags the actual representation in the U.S. population by a good bit. When we started cataloging this back in 2018, just before some legislation was passed in California, African Americans on Fortune 500 company boards represented 8.6% of the population. Latinx was 3.8%. Asian and Pacific Islander, 3.7%, and Anglo or white was 84%. As we move forward to the more recent numbers, we are still looking at a holding pattern of about 84%. Latinos make up 18.5% of the population, but fill just 2.2% of board seats in the Russell 3000 company boards. People who identify as either Black or African American represent 12.5% of the population, but hold about 4.1% of the Russell 3000 board seats. And in addition, there's 37% of the S&P 500 that had absolutely no persons identifying as Black on their boards. Women have fared a little bit better with 45% of the new Russell 3000 board seats and 46% of the S&P board seats as of about 2019. With that year, however, women held just 19% of all Russell 3000 board seats and about 25% of the seats on the S&P. Latino Corporate Directors Association found that 35%, or 233 of 662 California-based public companies had all white boards, and 87% had no Latino representation. So now enter the legal framework. In California, Governor Newsom signed in 2020 a legislation that was to mirror an early legislation that promoted women on boards. And in this instance, it added the notion of diversity and directors on boards from what is deemed underrepresented communities. This includes women, people from the LGBT community, Latinx, Asian, as well as African American and Black. What it provides is that at least one director will be on a board of a California company by the end of 2021. 2 to 3 directors from underrepresented communities will be on boards by the end of 2022. So we're not talking about, going into a majority situation, but sort of this onesie twosie, which we will get into later as we discuss kind of the implications of this. Back in 2018, there was a previous legislation that focused primarily on women. And we saw the uptake in women on boards increase pretty dramatically in California, which was kind of our petri dish. And so just in August of 2021, the SEC approved the NASDAQ rule. And so, Val, I know you had a long career at the SEC. Can you tell us a little bit about that rule and what you think kind of the background thinking was with respect to that?
So yes, happy. Thanks so much, Jill, and absolutely agree with you. Pleasure to be here today with everyone. So yes, NASDAQ Rule 5606, the SEC approved it last year, and it's kind of groundbreaking to see an actual market. When you think about fundamental market infrastructure, you have broker-dealers, you have investment advisors, you have asset managers, but then you have the actual markets themselves, which have the direct relationship with the issuers who are seeking to be publicly traded and to fundraise on those markets. So to see an actual market take the onerous step of amending its rule book and going through the rule filing process with the SEC for something that many people thought was quite controversial and very progressive was kind of groundbreaking. So the rule has 3 primary components, and it's very consistent with the federal approach to securities regulation. When Jill is going to talk later about some of the states and the approach that some of the states are taking, but NASDAQ is regulated by the SEC, and as such, the federal approach has always been one of a disclosure-based regime, not a prescriptive requirement, but it's really, the motivation is stakeholders and shareholders should have access to all material information to inform their decision-making, whether it's related to voting or whether it's related to investing. And we've heard from, I was at the SEC for over a decade. Prior to that, I was at FINRA, which used to be a part of NASDAQ. And as things have changed, especially over the past decade, we've seen a substantial amount of interest from family offices, the asset management community, investors. They want to know more about the companies that they are potentially investing in. And it's along the lines of the ESG, the environmental social governance movement. We want to know about the makeup of your board and are you committed to diversity? Because where is America headed? We are becoming a far more diverse country. It was a diverse country at the outset, but the power structure wasn't necessarily diverse. And so looking at, when you're thinking about NASDAQ Rule 5606, it is a disclosure-based regime. So the requirement is that either that companies listed on NASDAQ, that they have at least one woman and at least one underrepresented minority or someone from the LGBTQ plus community. Even though you're not absolutely required to meet that standard, you have to disclose why you haven't met that standard. And so it's a disclosure-based regime that's not mandating that, oh, you have to have diversity to be listed on NASDAQ or to remain listed on NASDAQ. What it's saying is you need to provide stakeholders and shareholders with the requisite information for them to make that judgment call, whether they want to invest in you and whether you're going in the direction that's commensurate with their fundamental values and where they believe the company should be headed. Along with that, I think one of the things that was really that's interesting about the rule is that they provide for companies who do not don't meet the requirements, they do provide a free service of 4 different consultants that will help you identify candidates that are qualified. That's something that Chastity will talk about later in the discussion, that common refrain that, well, we really want diversity, but we just can't find qualified candidates. Well, she's here to dispel that myth for you. So looking at what's happened since, looking at California in particular, Jill raised the California rule. So in June of 2018, 29% of California companies had all male boards. As of December 31st, 2019, only 4% of California companies had all male boards. So you do see that there is a reaction and that companies are attempting to comply, and it is having it's completely altering the landscape. Something of note, however, is that like affirmative action, many of these diversity and inclusion efforts have disproportionately benefited white women to the exclusion of people of color. And also the LGBTQ plus community. So those are things that still require a substantial amount of progress in remediation. I want to turn it over to Chastity to answer, and discuss why diversity on boards is important.
Thank you, Val and Jill. I love all the statistics you've mentioned that kind of lead us down the road to why this is such an important topic in your discussion of the NASDAQ and other rules. I think that we all recognize the importance of companies and driving the global economy. So that's not something we usually need to talk about in detail, but when we think about the importance of companies to our economy and then their impact just on everyone's everyday life, from policy making to employment to philanthropic endeavors that many companies embark upon in the communities in which they exist, to the ability to wealth building, and we talk about economic disparities and economic justice. Companies play, including listed companies, play such an important role in everyone's everyday lives. And so I think you go from there on a macro level to we should all have an interest in ensuring that these companies are operating in the best way they can from both an ethical perspective, how are they citizens of our society in a meaningful way, to an economic perspective. Do they have the very best mix of backgrounds and perspectives in the boardroom, helping to make really important decisions that we all have a vested interest in. And so for that reason, this topic is something that impacts everyone. And that's why I'm excited to be here today, unpacking the importance and how we can help drive visibility to the topic and diversity in the boardroom.
I do think that, you all have raised some interesting points about the economic might of corporations and that impact that they are having. So much like when we desegregated corporations, people may forget, certainly our kids don't remember a time when the color of your skin was patently a reason not to be hired. And so there were legal challenges to that. Affirmative action came about. Also, just anti-discrimination laws, the EEOC, all of those things had to be something that was legislated to get traction. But once it did, people can't imagine a time before that. And so when people think about, is a legal approach actually making a difference? Is it required? Well, the California law, as we talked about earlier, really increased the representation of women very quickly. We have just seen the underrepresented persons law come into play. So it'll be interesting to see if we're able to get that same uptake. The other thing is, we always talk about if you don't measure it or manage it in corporations, does it get done? These are the kinds of things that you have to be able to go outside your comfort zone. There are networks that are created. There's a reason that when we first get the uptake, we get it within white women, because white women and white men still had very similar networks. And we'll talk about that more. In particular, I'm going to want Chastity to tell you all a little bit about New Roundtable and how that network was created, very quickly. But I think that you've got to begin with legislation. One, because it puts everybody on a level playing field, and two, because it is the impetus. It takes people from zero. There has to be some catalyst. There are also other catalysts, like the increasing desire of the constituencies, your customers, wanting to see this diversity. But I think that many times this doesn't come without something that is, one, a leveler, and helps people to understand how that's going to work for them. So one of the challenges becomes, are we creating quotas? And, in Europe, they have no bones about it. They've actually created quotas. But, how do we address some of the legal challenges?
And I think to the quotas idea, that is something that, when you look at the approach that some of the states have taken with the blue sky laws, it's been more of a quota-based system. And we saw, we just talked about how NASDAQ has taken a more of a target-based, disclosure-based regime. And when you're thinking about how corporations actually function and their normal day-to-day operations to achieve, alpha, to achieve whatever the business goals are from an operational perspective, and a growth perspective, it's really done through the development of strategies, setting targets, figuring out where the pressure points are, and coming up with meaningful and viable solutions to overcome those issues. And so there's a substantial amount of academic studies, but also just information out in the market that strongly suggest and demonstrate that a target-based approach is preferable and more effective than a quotas-based, because a quotas-based is much more inflexible. It's like, hey, Jill, Chastity, you need to have 2 of these people, and once you're done with that, not a big deal. You've checked the box, and it leaves off the thinking through, how do we retain, promote, and create an inclusive environment so that these people are fully integrated and it becomes a part of our culture? So the target approach really forces companies to dig in deeper, commit resources, identify problems, but also solutions, potential solutions. There's going to be failures. It's inevitable, but at least you learn in that process. It's an iterative process. And so I think that when you're talking about targets versus quotas, quotas sometimes can be easier because it can require less. It's like, okay, we found people, but we don't feel the need to really fully engage them, right?
Exactly.
Whereas
they're on the island.
Exactly. Whereas a target-based approach really does speak to a much more flexible, organic, moving approach that allows for adjustments as needed, and it becomes a part of the culture. And I think that that's absolutely key. Jill, Chastity, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that as well.
Well, and Chastity, also, if you could talk a little bit about the role, the external pressure of shareholder reps, the public that consumes whatever the product is or service in seeing this increase.
Yeah, that's a good point. And before I address that, I want to circle back to something Val said about the NASDAQ rule and how it's disclosure based. And I want to underscore that that's very powerful, because no one wants to spend their time making disclosures about why they haven't met those requirements. You know, when we're as someone who plays a heavy hand in drafting our disclosures and circling up internally, that's an uncomfortable conversation. We'd rather be talking about, okay, here's how we've met the requirement. Here's why it's important that we do and continue to do so. Let's have a robust discussion of our, board recruitment process and how we have diverse slates of candidates and et cetera. We'd much rather spend our time disclosing that. And so disclosure rules are very powerful in that regard, because that includes the thought that Val talked about into our processes and how we're operating. And then, I think somebody mentioned in the chat as well, I think it was Ernest, a good point about ISS and the various ratings agencies. We spend a lot of time obviously paying attention to our stakeholders. And we have stakeholders that are our employees, our communities, our investors, for sure, and ISS and Glass Lewis, et cetera. And we do monitor our scores for various reasons and go into detail on, where are areas that we can and should be improving. We report that to the one of our board committees quarterly. And so that is another pressure point of us really needing to dig in and face not just the numbers, but okay, what should or could we be doing differently? Because not having diversity on our board is a big part of the score, and ratings agencies like ISS do a good job of driving attention to that by tying it to our score. And it's a number. Companies love numbers. We can see where we stand. We can benchmark against and see what other companies are doing. So it makes it very simple for us to say, hey, we need to spend a part of every one of these meetings talking about why our score is low in these areas and what we're going to do about it.
Yeah, and how that affects the wealth building that happens, within the company, but also the brand representation. When you think about how brands are viewed, it impacts their treatment in the courtroom because the public has a certain feeling about them. If there is something that happens within a company, but it is seen as a company that is embracing the community that it's a part of, or, and be that their little place in their one state or nationally or globally. Global representation matters in terms of that brand piece. And so if you are having that ugly discussion about why you can't find people, I think we've seen memes on things like, the binder of women, or, we just don't know where they are. And, so you do not want to become the subject of memes. So there's very real brand risk in some of that discussion that you would have to have. So the disclosure piece, I think, is phenomenal. Also, when we're dealing with any kind of quota, I think Val made this point, but I wanted to underscore it. You really don't want to be checking a box and one and done. It really is about how are you crafting your board dynamic? Are you bringing all of the skill set? And if you just have a one and done, do you really have the full panoply? No one wants to sit on the board and represent the entirety of their community by virtue of, them. It's like, I don't think any of us are that much of a monolith that, we can be represented by the one person, nor do we want to, be in that position. So we've got a question here that I thought was interesting, and it kind of dovetails off some of my remarks, which is, let's see here. I know there's an organization that's trying to get companies to take a second look at who is handling their investments and trying to diversify investment managers and investment management companies from traditionally non-diverse companies to minority-owned, minority-run investment groups. Any words of advice about how to use our seat at the table to bring this forward?
I think that is a very, very salient point and something that I spend a substantial amount of time focused on. I think it's really understanding part of what is driving this desire for diversity. And America is in the process of the greatest wealth transfer it's ever seen. The transfer of, hundreds of trillions of dollars from baby boomers to millennials. And millennials have a very different idea about what it means to diligence investments. And they also have very different ideas about who they want to manage those investments. So whereas, it may have been done a certain way, and people were comfortable with the status quo, that is now being upended. And it is a constant topic of conversation from who's being staffed at, from an asset management perspective. Our firm represents a large number. We have a thriving family office practice. And we represent, industry, the family office industry. And something that I am routinely contacted about from family office clients is they want to know, how can you diversify the people who are providing us advice? How do you're in the financial services space? You represent broker dealers, registered investment advisors, asset managers. You deal with hedge funds. Can you point us in the direction of ones that have diversity or a commitment to diversity? And you're really seeing it as those assets are being passed on to a new generation. They are absolutely, it's not a question, it is a demand. And so it's kind of part and parcel capitalism. You see supply and demand. There is demand out there, and now everyone is pivoting to, even if they're not pivoting to address the issue, they are at least aware and cognizant and listening to the conversations. And there are many different ways to influence that process. If you look at NASDAQ's rule proposal to the SEC, there are pages of studies. They had to evidence and demonstrate that this rule was in the public's best interest and that it would lead to market integrity and fairness. And so, the SEC had a duty to find, before they could approve that rule, that it was in the public interest. And so when you look at the amount of information and substance detailed by NASDAQ, it talks about, and also look at the comments as well. Once it was proposed, was put out for notice and comment, and there were a lot of comments, and it pretty much spanned the range of responses that you would expect, but the overwhelming majority were in favor of the rule. And you had a lot of industry associations, you had a lot of asset managers, you had a lot of key stakeholders saying, we vote based on, if you're a large institution and you have substantial voting power, those institutions, those industry groups are saying, yeah, we're looking at those boards, and if they have no diversity, we're voting against them. So it has, even if you don't see the direct impact, there is definitely an extreme indirect impact in the board's ability to effectively operate and bring ideas and goals to fruition and move corporations forward in the appropriate manner. And that also feeds down to the, financial intermediaries, the same exact concept. If you look back maybe a year or two ago, most of the bulge bracket, the largest banks and broker dealers on the street. They all signed a letter similar, not quite the Mansfield rule, but something similar to that, where they were committing to really making sure they had diverse candidates, that they were interviewing diverse candidates, that they were looking at their outside counsel and holding their outside counsel accountable to having diverse candidates or lawyers working on their matters. But also, it's not just about the diversity in an organization. It's about creation of an inclusive environment. You can always bring in color. Can you retain it and promote it? When recruiters and firms and corporations are reaching out to me and they're trying to recruit me, I want to know, I ask the question, like, how much diversity do you have? And then I want to talk to someone who's homegrown. I want to talk to someone who's been there and has made it through the ranks, not someone that you've brought in to churn and burn, not somebody that you've brought in to check some boxes and then quickly dismiss because you never really cared about their opinion and you're really not committed to diversity. So me as an individual, I think that way. And I also, I talk to so many various constituents, I hear the same thoughts relayed over and over again. We want to see a demonstrated commitment to diversity, that I'm not just going to be onboarded and then left to be an island to myself, where my thoughts and opinions are dismissed. I'm seen as just a diversity hire because I know I bring far more to the table than that. And so nobody wants to be in that position. So I think that those are things, I think that these are very relevant questions, and you absolutely have the ability to influence the staffing, whether it's at who you're using as an asset manager, who you're using as outside counsel, what companies you invest in, how you vote with the voting rights that you do have. It's multifaceted.
Indeed. And there was a question about which organization are you referencing with respect to the attempt to diversify investment managers and management companies. I'll tell you that when you think about companies that have even endowments or trust. Insurance companies are major allocators. Retirement companies are major allocators of funds into the investment community. Well, if you take something like the teachers' retirement, or in Dallas, the employee retirement fund, those dollars that create substantial wealth for those who invest that, those dollars are the primarily Black, Brown, Asian people who are teachers, who are first responders, who are forming, so you're taking the aggregation of people of colors and a lot of women. When you think about the teaching profession, you're aggregating their money. And if you're not helping to create wealth for their community, one, you're starting to stave off the pipe. I remember, my husband was running his logistics company. He would talk to people about diversification of a market and what that meant and the trickle down effects of that. And he said, if you really think you can make all the money you want just selling things to white men, then, have at it. But that is not the truth. When we think about the growth of China, when we think about the growth of India, that was all about population and access to a market, that had started to gain some wealth. And so if we're not increasing the wealth in the populations that are increasing, you're going to create wealth disparities that are not just, that is a sad thing. That is a devastating thing for democracy, for the economy, just for the well-being of humanity. And so these kinds of things have, and universities as well, when they think about, who's attending their universities, and they are major allocators of funds. And so they are looking to diversify because they understand at the grassroots level that this is building a market. This is not, if you don't care about equality or what have you, a lot of people care about self-interest. And that self-interest is, if you have a smaller market, then that market will dissipate.
And I think part of what we're saying is everyone on this call understands that this is a top of book topic. And we don't believe it's going away. And you want to pre-position yourself, because when I talk about that homegrown, the demonstrated, we have an environment, we have an inclusive environment. That happens over a period of time. It doesn't happen overnight, and it isn't without hiccups or problems. To really create an inclusive environment, it takes a lot of hard work, commitment, and effort. And so I think one of the key takeaways I would say from this is that even if you don't place a value on it today, or let's just say that you're like, I see it, I understand it, but it's not something I want to, it's not one of those problems that are top of book for me that I want to tackle today. 2 to 5 years from now, you'll have serious regrets, because this isn't going away, and it's only going to become something that is more acute. And you want to already have that demonstrated commitment.
So Chastity, I know that you, years ago, as a fairly young lawyer at that time, you identified with a group of women that had come out of law school with you that was seeing the effects of the absence of diversity. Can you talk a little bit about your founding of New Roundtable and what you all have been able to build and what it said about diversity?
Sure, yeah. So when we were, I guess, 3, 4, 5 years out of law school, there was a group of us in Dallas, all Black women, and we faced similar challenges that I'm sure everyone's heard about in the profession, from being at a law firm and not having access to clients and business development opportunities or plush work assignments, to being in-house and trying to navigate the politics of moving up the corporate ladder and getting that next promotion or somewhere along the path to GC. And we noticed some themes every time we get together for happy hour. We'd share some successes, but we'd also share some common roadblocks that we were facing, and just recognize that, like, a lot of, as we all know, a lot of relationships control a lot in the legal profession. Who who you're able to have access to can get you in the door with a client, can get you your next job or board seat, et cetera. And we just asked the question that, what if we focused a little bit insularly and focused on what we could do to help one another? We all had contacts, we all had relationships. Could we amplify those and amplify one another in order to help each other within our networks? And we began to be very intentional about doing that. And so those of us who were in-house, well, first we worked on ourselves. We all recognized that we still needed to have, technical competencies in order to move up through the ranks. Those are table stakes. And so we would engage with influencers such as Jill Lewis and her husband, Randy, who came in and talked to us about, what they did in their path and how we could be successful on our paths. So we worked on ourselves, but we also began to nominate each other for awards in the Dallas legal market, because people don't just win awards for Corporate Counsel of the Year. Someone's nominating them. And a lot of times we're not a part of these conversations. So we look up and we say, oh, wow, how are these people winning these awards? Well, it's because they have friends nominating them who know the good work they've done, and they're amplifying that. And so we began to do that for one another. We began to, we'd hear about a job opportunity, we'd pass it along within the group. And not only that, spend some political capital in recommending that person to the hiring manager, getting their resume to the top of the stack. And so the same for business development. We weren't all GCs at the time, but we had the ability to, within our company, say, hey, I know a great M&A lawyer. You should take a look at her for the next deal, or at least provide an introduction so that person's law firm knew that they had the ability to develop business in a way that maybe the partner down the hall couldn't, because they didn't have the same relationship. So when you're talking about new markets, that's also important, because we have this entire cohort of Black women in Dallas moving up through the ranks and making sure that we were also reaching out and allowing our peers at law firms to develop business with us and bringing kind of a new market into their law firm. And so just fast forward 7, 8 years from that time, it's been very successful in terms of results. And so we have general counsel in the group, and we have partners at law firms, we have people on board seats, and not that we haven't networked with people outside of our group, because we absolutely have. I think it takes a diverse array of of folks in your corner and mentors and colleagues that you network with to reach any level of success. But we recognize that we had everything we needed within our group as well. And so we need to focus specifically on us because the intersection of race and gender does present unique challenges. And we determined that we were in a position, maybe the best position, to understand those struggles for one another and to help one another overcome those struggles and to be successful. And now we focus a lot of our time and attention on the pipeline. And so we're mentoring law students, or we're talking to college students about a path they could have in law, and hopefully providing an example of women they can look up to and help them along the way, just like we reached out to people like Jill, and she did that for us.
So, and Val, can you talk a little bit about how your discussions in your networks around increasing the diversity in what has not been a very diverse part of the profession, as somebody who advises, right on the trading floor, who is on the absolute cutting edge of new creation of wealth and new mediums for that? How is diversity impacting that?
Thanks, Jill. Sorry, I'm having technical issues. So yes, it is something that, being on the regulatory side somewhat insulated me because the majority of my career had been on the regulatory side. And so that made it easier to do what Chastity was talking about, finding an insular group of cohorts of women who were similarly situated, women of color who had similar experiences, but had exceptional technical expertise. We're definitely ambitious, and I know that's that can be a negative term as applied to women of color. It's ambitious and aggressive, but really being able to have that connectivity. And as we did exactly what Chastity was saying, we shared information, because oftentimes when you're in-house, information is basically money. That is what you need, access to information, and especially on the government side, because your salary's capped. So you're not going to get any additional money. So the people trade in information and headcount. That's how it's done. And so it was really about creating what we called the underground, where we shared information. We trained one another. If I was focused on trading issues and someone else was focused on policy issues and someone else was a securities litigator, we commonly shared that information so that we all grew collectively outside of our specific areas or niche areas of expertise. And then as we matured in our careers, that just led to the ability to, when people call me and ask me for someone who has a background in a corporate securities lawyer or an M&A lawyer, and they're looking for diversity, I can list off many people, both men and women, who are highly qualified and exceptionally well trained. And so when I think about, being on the cutting edge, oftentimes, I do a substantial amount of work, whether by force or by by will, in the crypto space, and the technology isn't going anywhere. It is what it is. It's going to revolutionize the way business operates and the way that we interact and transact. But it's interesting that a lot of the conversation is about crypto is about the democratization of things. But when you look past it, anybody who's been in the industry for any meaningful amount of time, you see the ECVC money, the PE money, you see the exact same players controlling all of these platforms behind all of these. But the investors are very much retail facing, and it's much more diverse than it's ever been. I mean, the diversity is exponential. And so there's this this misconception that, you know, this is leading to more equity, and it's still the same people behind the scenes making all the money, and it's still being done off the backs of the people who are less sophisticated. It is retail money. And so when thinking about that, we've been working with a number of groups. Jill, you and I worked on a specific client with you that's really focused on not just creating a pipeline, but also education. The fundamental key is educating. Like, what does it mean to invest? How do we provide you with access to learn to invest early on? How do you understand risk tolerance? How do you understand what your time horizon is and what's suitable for you? So I think it's multifaceted in that you're looking at, you know, insularly from a professional perspective, how do I create a pipeline? How do I pass on what I know? How do I make it easier for someone else so that they don't have the same struggles that I had? How do I cross-pollinate to ensure that other people are also getting opportunities, that you can't have a unicorn attitude? Everybody runs into those people who have to be the unicorn. I can only be the only one. That doesn't work. And that's not diversity. And so it's looking at it from that perspective, but it's also going out in your personal life and thinking about how our ability, the things that we have access to, how we can pay that forward and use our time and ability to, in a meaningful way, guide the future, guide the present, but really looking toward the future. And sharing our knowledge, sharing our contacts, educating, whether it's volunteering at high schools, junior high schools, going into neighborhoods that we may not live in, but knowing that they're underserved communities and investing in those, because we have to be the change we seek.
Absolutely. That is, you know, we could almost end it right there. I want to double back a little bit to something that you said around, you know, education. One of the things that, because I've been in practice long enough to see the evolution of disclosures, they did not always have that, you know, paragraph where they talk about specifically what talents are your board members bringing? What are their skill sets? Why are they on that board? And I find as we evolve more toward meritocracy, we do actually evolve more toward diversity. And so understanding that you have to reach outside of given networks. If all of your buddies are only, you know, oil and gas, and you really need to start evolving into clean tech, then you've got to start looking at people who've got that type of business, who have that type of experience. If you're in a consumer brand, you need to be able to evolve. And so as we members and participants in the legal community, members of ACC, really, you're the ones who are going to be called upon to step up to this service. We find that because law was such a meritocracy, you find a lot more diversity among lawyers than you do Fortune 500 CEOs. And if you're only looking at Fortune 500 CEOs or Fortune 500 CFOs to populate your board, you're going to run out of people that are diverse people. You're just not going to have the numbers that are necessary. But if you look at certain other professions that have become more diverse, and I would include the law, I would include our ability to understand and learn about a business through being part of the in-house bar as well. You are the ones who will be called to serve. And so looking at disclosure documents, looking at 10Ks, looking at what they say about the board and its makeup and why helps you to know, one, who to refer in, and also if that's something that would be appropriate for you to be a part of.
One thing I wanted to just hear your thoughts on is, and it's something that we've all heard, is, we really want diversified candidates, but we can't find qualified ones. And how you respond to that.
I think it goes back to what Jill was saying. Where are we looking? and how, you've evolved from friends and family on boards, which I think every public company knows that just doesn't fly anymore. Jill talked about the skills matrix and the accountability for what board members are actually bringing to the table for a company, and investors are interested in that. Then you go to, well, we only need either former CEOs or operators on boards. That again is a place where, okay, there are only so many of them. And now we're discovering they don't necessarily have all the skills we need for the future of corporations, where companies need to go anyway. And you have the same group of people over and over. So if you're getting your diversity, like Jill said, from former CEOs, then you've got 10 people in the country who are sitting on all the boards, on the public company boards. And that's an issue too, because there's overboarding, and that's something you can't have as well. And so I think it's really where we're looking, and people are starting to recognize that, one, most people don't have a diverse network of friends and people they just know. That's in and of itself an issue that I think each of us needs to look within ourselves and deal with. If we're going through our Rolodex and we can't find a single quote unquote, qualified Black person, for instance, to reach out to refer for a job or a board, we need to deal with that issue ourselves. And that includes me. I need to make sure that I have a diverse array of people with a bunch of wonderful skill sets that I can always call upon. But then two, we need to recognize the issue and seek help. Seek a network of people who may know someone who can make an introduction to a fantastic person who has all the qualifications, brings a diverse or new perspective to the board, et cetera. So we can't be insular anymore. We can't rely on the same networks. And you see that with public company boards. We, more and more reaching out for help and bringing in someone who does have a diverse network of qualified people, and whether it's a recruiting firm, et cetera, that specifically help us with these issues. And then having why it's important to have diverse team of executives as well. I'm the first to point out that, okay, if we're trying to diversify, we shouldn't bring in only white male vendors to help us with either our diversity program, to help us find diverse candidates. That doesn't even make any sense. So we're starting from the wrong place to begin with. And so just having enough people at the table to think through our premises and challenge what we've done before and our assumptions at the very outset, I think helps. And then we begin to see better results and a more diverse group of candidates pretty effortlessly, I would say, as a result of putting that work in up front.
Absolutely. And I like your point about being sort of pan-diverse, because we need to be able to say, not only do we know of people who look like us, but do we know of people kind of across the board in every ethnicity, gender, and that having that understanding, because it does bring about a better result. If you've ever been someplace and it's just, all one gender, let's say, the behavior is different than if you have multiple genders present, because there's a yin and a yang to it. And they've done studies about the carefulness of boards. They've done studies about the willingness to go into details, the willingness to focus on different aspects of that decision making that are fueled by the fact that there were people who were not homogenous in the room. And if we look at the impact that corporations have on our society, from the wealth creation to employment to environmental to equal justice, those are the realms in which we need to have all of the best voices thinking about all of these incredibly difficult problems that we're facing, on the planet. And so bringing in diverse minds, when you think about even the speed at which the COVID vaccine was developed, it's because we had a global and diverse group of people who were focused on how quickly can they share information, learn, grow, And we all know that being able to deal with this pandemic has been one of the things that has, been most gripping on humanity over the last 18, 24 months. So that is but one example of how diversity is actually something that is, planet saving and humanity saving.
Agreed. And just, I have to share anecdotally. Maybe about 2 months ago, one client reached out to me, and it was their hiring committee. They were looking to hire someone to oversee a trading desk, and someone very senior. And there were 5 people on the hiring committee. There was one person of color, and the rest it was homogeneous. And the comment was, well, Val, we just can't find any qualified candidates of color. And I was ready to respond, but the one person of color on the hiring panel spoke up and chuckled, and they were like, that's really interesting. We just hired a general counsel who's less qualified than I am. And yet you didn't have a problem hiring him because he looked, and they were like, well, we wouldn't go that far. He has the connections, and it's really about, he's really more to be a face. And it was like, well, when you look at the description that you're applying for, your diverse candidate, then it's very prescriptive. There's no flexibility. It doesn't account for, the fact that there will likely need to be some training, some integration, some mentoring. And he laid out the fact, he was like, the general counsel knows less than I do. I constantly am teaching up to him. And so there are certain exceptions made. You have to recognize the unconscious and conscious bias that is involved in the process. That if you look a certain way, there is a presumption that you are fit for the job. If you do not, there is a presumption that you are not fit. And it's something that, dealing with Wall Street day to day, I overcome a number of handicaps here, like age perception, gender, skin color. There's a plethora of them. And so being able to recognize and own in the discussions up front as you're searching for candidates that there is both conscious and unconscious bias, and say, if this resume was that of a white male, how would I approach it? And be honest about it.
Absolutely. And they've done studies on that. It was interesting to me when I began my practice. I remember men who were Jewish, who were new to the law firm, and they said, oh, I came out, and they were just sort of titans of securities law. They were like, oh, when I came out, they would not hire Jews at a lot of these firms. And so I ended up going into the SEC. And they ended up, being very, very good at what they did, learning everything in the SEC. Similarly, having conversations with people who grew up when being Ivy League meant that you definitely weren't Italian, and having people tell me about what it was like in New York to be unable to get certain jobs because you were Italian. So this is not a new thing. And it's as we sort of move forward, I think, it's the evolution of our society in a good way. And the next generation of customers and professionals are going to require it. I see my kids making ESG-based decisions on their consumption, and they do it virally. So this is something that, is game changing, because this is the direction, that the trend of, what you'll invest in and what companies will be winners and losers. So I think we're about almost at the top of the hour. I don't know if there was a last question or something that anybody would like to share. But thank you very much, Val and Chastity. It's always a pleasure to spend time with the two of you. I learn a lot from you, and it's a very affirming thing to be in this company and to look toward the future.
Likewise. Thank you, Jill. And thanks everyone for having us. Great.
Yes.